Welcome to this deep dive, and we're going to be tackling something today that's pretty unsettling, honestly, the weaponization of sex. You sent over some source material for this one, and I have to say, I'm a little apprehensive to dig into this. But you know what they say, knowledge is power.
I think that's a really good mindset to have going into this. The material you sent over is definitely intense, no doubt, but it's important stuff. It's
Yeah.
important to understand the different ways that sex can be used as a weapon and the impact it has on individuals, even entire societies.
So before we dive into the specifics, can we just define what the weaponization of sex even means? It sounds pretty straightforward, but I feel like there's probably a lot of nuance that we need to unpack there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There is. At its core, weaponization of sex means using sex or sexuality to harm someone, to control them, or to manipulate them. And it hinges a lot on a power imbalance, where one person exploits their position, their influence, to take advantage of another person.
I can already see how this could manifest in so many different ways. It's not just physical violence, right?
Right, exactly.
Our sources actually outline 4 different distinct forms of weaponized sex.
Yeah. So we're talking about things like sexual exploitation, where someone uses their position of power to coerce another person into sexual acts. And then there's sexual violence, which can be things like rape or assault, harassment, but it's used specifically as a tool of domination and control. And it doesn't stop there. We also have revenge and retaliation. So that would be things like revenge porn or using someone's sexuality to hurt their reputation, or maybe to try to extract financial gain. And then finally, we have political and social manipulation. And this is where sex scandals are used to try to control individuals or to sway public opinion.
Okay, wow. So we have this framework now of the 4 main forms of weaponized sex. What I'm really curious about is how this actually plays out in real life. The cases that you sent over are kind of all over the map. We've got Hollywood, politics, the music industry, even wartime atrocities.
Yeah, and that's what's so disturbing, is it's a sobering reminder, I think, that it's not just some theoretical concept, this weaponization of sex. It's a pattern of behavior with real consequences. And the cases you selected, I think, really illustrate how diverse and how pervasive this issue actually is.
Okay, so the first one that really jumps out at me is the Harvey Weinstein case.
Hmm.
I mean, this guy was like a titan in Hollywood, and his abuse of power was just, I mean, when these allegations first came out, it was like an earthquake,
Yeah.
you know?
It was a seismic shift, for sure.
Yeah.
Weinstein was ultimately convicted, right,
Okay.
of rape and sexual assault. But what makes this case so significant, I think, is how he used his position as a producer to exploit women systematically for decades.
Yeah. And you know what I find so disturbing is how he used his influence to silence these victims and keep his behavior under wraps for so long.
Mm.
It almost felt like he was untouchable.
Yeah, and that's a common thread we see in a lot of these cases,
Right.
where abusers exploit their power and they create these climates of fear and intimidation. And that makes it incredibly difficult for the victims to come forward. And the fact that so many women did eventually come forward in this case, including these high-profile actresses like Gwyneth Paltrow, Ashley Judd, it's a testament to their bravery. It's a testament to the power of collective action, really.
Yeah. And we can't forget the impact that this case had on the wider culture, too.
Yeah.
Like, this was a major catalyst for the Me Too movement, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It ripped the Band-Aid off a festering wound.
Yeah.
I think it resonated so powerfully because it exposed a systemic problem, not just in Hollywood, but in so many different industries, in workplaces across the board. And it really empowered these survivors to share their stories and demand accountability. And I think it really did force society at large to finally confront how pervasive sexual harassment and assault actually are.
Yeah. Amazing how one case can trigger such a massive cultural shift, huh? Speaking of cultural shifts, the next case you sent over takes place in the political arena.
Mm-hmm.
Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky.
Mm.
Now, this case I think is particularly interesting because while the affair itself might not be a clear-cut example of manipulation,
Mm-hmm.
it was definitely weaponized by Clinton's political opponents.
Mm-hmm.
It was used to discredit him,
Yeah.
attack his presidency.
Yeah, and Monica Lewinsky, a young woman at the beginning of her career, was essentially thrown under the bus.
Yeah.
Her life and her reputation were completely upended by this scandal.
Lovely.
It became very public.
And it's mind-boggling how something that's technically, a private matter between 2 consenting adults can be twisted into this weapon of mass destruction in the political arena. And speaking of destruction, the next case on our list is perhaps one of the most disturbing examples of weaponized sex I've ever encountered. Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell.
Ah,
Oh,
Yeah. This case is really a chilling example of just pure exploitation and abuse of power. Epstein, using his wealth and connections, he created this network for trafficking and sexual exploitation of minors. It wasn't just about the individual acts of abuse, it was a systemic operation designed to prey on these vulnerable young girls.
And Maxwell was his right hand, procuring these girls, even participating in the abuse herself. It's horrifying to think about the level of manipulation and control they exerted over these victims, many of whom were just children.
It's a stark reminder that wealth and influence can be used to silence victims and evade accountability for years, sometimes even decades. The fact that this went on for so long, with so many powerful people seemingly turning a blind eye, it's deeply unsettling.
Yeah. It raises serious questions about complicity and the extent to which these powerful networks protect abusers. And it definitely leaves you with a sense of unease knowing that these kinds of things are happening in the shadows, even among, the elite.
And it really underscores how important it is that we shine a light in those dark corners, that we hold the powerful accountable, and that we believe and support the survivors. It's a wake-up call, reminding us that the fight against sexual exploitation is far from over.
Okay, so we've just finished discussing Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, and it's easily one of the most disturbing examples of weaponized sex I can even think of.
Yeah.
And what really strikes me is that even though all these cases are so diverse, we're talking Hollywood, politics, the music industry, even wartime atrocities, there seems to be this, common thread running through them all, right?
Yeah, and it's fascinating because despite the different contexts, there's this really clear pattern of power dynamics at play. So in each of these cases, the abuser, the perpetrator, they held this position of power, whether it was social, financial, political, and they exploit that power to control and to manipulate their victims.
So it's not just about the sex itself, it's about using sex as a way to assert dominance, assert control.
Precisely. It's about exploiting vulnerabilities and using sex as this weapon, essentially, to maintain that power imbalance.
Right.
So we think about Harvey Weinstein using his influence as a producer to coerce these actresses into these sexual acts, or Jeffrey Epstein leveraging his wealth to silence victims and evade accountability for years.
Yeah, and it's not always about brute force or overt threats either.
Right.
The R. Kelly case that we discussed earlier really highlights how insidious that psychological manipulation can be. He was using his fame and the allure of stardom to basically manipulate these young women who were hoping to, break into the music industry.
That's such a crucial point because the weaponization of sex often involves this really significant psychological component where the manipulation preys on the victim's insecurities, their ambitions, their dreams. These abusers are really skilled at twisting the whole concept of consent and making the victim feel like they have no choice but to comply.
It's like a total mind game. And it makes me think about the broader societal impact of these cases. For example, the Me Too movement, which gained all this momentum after the Weinstein scandal. That's really shifted the conversation around sexual harassment and sexual assault.
Yeah, for sure. The Me Too movement has been a complete watershed moment. I mean, it's provided this platform for survivors to share their stories, to demand accountability, and it's forced us to confront these uncomfortable truths about just how pervasive these issues are, particularly in workplaces where you see these power imbalances so frequently. And it's really challenged us to rethink our understanding of consent, of power, and accountability.
We're finally starting to see a shift in the way that we talk about consent.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just say no means no anymore, right? We have to acknowledge that true consent can only exist when there is a balance of power. And that coercion or manipulation, it totally negates this idea of free will.
I think that is a really critical insight. Consent is not just about saying yes or no. It's about the context in which that decision is made. And when someone is in a position of power over another person, it can be incredibly difficult to refuse their advances, even if you feel pressured, even if you feel uncomfortable.
Yeah. Makes you wonder how many situations are out there where consent is given under duress, where someone feels like they don't have any other option but to comply. And it makes me think back to the Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky case. Even though technically their relationship was between two consenting adults, it really highlighted how sex can be used as this political weapon, especially in this day and age of the 24-hour news cycle and social media.
Yeah, that case was such a prime example of how quickly a private matter can be completely twisted and manipulated for political gain. And sadly, it was Monica Lewinsky who bore the brunt of the public shaming of the scrutiny. She was a young woman at the start of her career.
And it's a stark reminder of these double standards that still exist,
When it comes to sex and gender, Women are often judged more harshly than men for their sexual behavior. And women's experiences, they're often dismissed or minimized.
And that case also really showed how the media can play a role in perpetuating those really harmful narratives.
Yeah.
The way that Lewinsky was portrayed, even the language that was used to describe her,
Right.
it all contributed to this culture of victim blaming and slut-shaming that, unfortunately, continues to this day.
Yeah. It's frustrating because it feels like we've made some progress in some areas, but then you see cases like this and you realize how deeply ingrained those power imbalances and those double standards really are. And it makes you wonder how many other stories are out there, how many people have been silenced or had their experiences completely minimized because of these same power dynamics.
It's a sobering thought, and that's why it's so important that we keep having these conversations.
To challenge these really harmful patterns, to create a culture where survivors feel safe coming forward, knowing that they'll be believed, knowing they'll be supported.
We've been talking about the complexities of these power dynamics
Mm.
and the manipulation and this broader societal impact of these cases.
Mm.
But I think it's so crucial to remember the human cost of all of this.
Mm.
The victims, the women, the girls, the men, their lives are forever altered by these experiences.
Absolutely. We can't lose sight of the trauma, the pain, the long-lasting impact of these acts. These aren't just abstract concepts we're discussing here. These are real people whose lives have been shattered by abuse and exploitation.
It's heartbreaking to think about the emotional and the psychological, even physical scars that these people carry with them.
Yeah.
And for some, like the victims of the rape of Nanking, the trauma extends beyond just the individual to entire communities.
Yeah. And the intergenerational trauma that results from such widespread violence, it can have a devastating impact on families and societies for decades, even centuries. We're talking about a ripple effect that can disrupt the very fabric of a community.
It's a reminder that the consequences of these acts are so far-reaching. We can't just focus on punishing the perpetrators. We need to acknowledge the impact that their actions have on the victims, on society as a whole.
And it leads us to a really crucial question. What can we do about this? How do we address this problem? How do we create a world where sex is celebrated as a source of joy and connection and not a weapon of harm and control?
We've been talking about the lasting impact of this, the weaponization of sex on individuals and on communities. And honestly, I'm left feeling a little overwhelmed. It's such a complex issue, and it feels like it's so woven into the fabric of our society,
Yeah.
So I've been asked, what can we even do about this? Where do we even begin to address something that's so deeply ingrained?
Yeah, it's a big question. It is a crucial question. And I think the first step really is just acknowledging the scope of the problem.
Okay.
We need to be having these open and honest conversations about consent and about power dynamics and about the different ways that sex can be weaponized. We can't solve a problem that we don't fully understand, right?
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
But how do we even begin to have these conversations, especially with young people? I mean, these are heavy topics, and it feels like there's so much resistance to even talking about sex and sexuality in a way that's open and honest.
You're right. It's not easy, but it's necessary. We have to create these spaces where young people feel safe and supported in exploring these issues. We need comprehensive sex education that goes beyond, the mechanics of reproduction and addresses healthy relationships and consent and boundaries.
So, starting young, laying the foundation for a better understanding of these issues before, these harmful patterns of behavior can even become ingrained.
Exactly. Early intervention is key. By teaching young people about respect and empathy and healthy relationships, we can equip them with the skills they need to navigate these really complex issues later on.
That makes sense. But what about, the systems that allow this kind of abuse to flourish? What can we do to, actually hold abusers accountable and protect victims, especially when these abusers are in these positions of power?
We need to create this culture of accountability.
Yeah.
And I think that starts with strengthening the legal frameworks that we have in place and ensuring that law enforcement is properly trained to handle these really sensitive cases of assault and exploitation. And then we also need to address those systemic biases that often protect abusers, that silence victims.
So you're talking about things like corruption or influence peddling or the way that these cases are often handled by the media or the justice system. It feels like the scales are often tipped in favor of the abuser, especially when they have wealth or status or connections.
It's a valid concern, and we need to challenge those power structures that shield abusers from facing any real consequences. We need to make sure that the legal process is fair and it's accessible to everyone, no matter what their social standing is, no matter what their resources are, and we need to hold these institutions accountable, the ones that protect abusers and enable a culture of silence.
And what about the role of the media in all of this? We talked earlier about how the media can often perpetuate these really harmful narratives
Right.
and contribute to this culture of victim blaming.
Uh-huh.
But can they also be part of the solution?
I think they absolutely can. The media has a huge influence on shaping public discourse and how we all perceive these issues. So we need responsible reporting. Reporting that centers the voices of the survivors, that avoids sensationalism, that challenges those harmful stereotypes.
So moving away from those salacious headlines and that focus on, the abuser's reputation and more on the experiences of the victims
Yeah.
and the systemic issues that actually contribute to these situations.
Exactly. The media has this responsibility to inform the public accurately and ethically by providing context, amplifying those voices of the survivors, and challenging harmful narratives. They can play a really crucial role in shifting public opinion and creating a more informed, more empathetic society.
This has been a tough conversation, but I'm really glad that we had it.
Me too.
It's easy to just feel totally overwhelmed by how big this problem is,
Yeah.
but I'm also feeling this, sense of hope.
Mm.
We talked about education, legal reform, media responsibility, and those all feel like tangible things that we can actually do to address this issue.
I agree. I think change is possible, but it requires a collective effort. All of us have a role to play in creating a world where sex is never, ever used as a weapon.
That's a powerful message.
Hmm.
So listeners, what will you do to be a part of the solution? What steps will you take to challenge these harmful patterns and create a world where everyone feels safe and respected? That's something I think we can all think about as we wrap up this deep dive.